Hi, good afternoon from Brazil. Hello, Anna. Hello, Rachel. Hello, Winston, and also Juliano. I'm very happy today, really, to have the opportunity to be together with really good friends and to debate. I think that one of the most fascinating issues considered climate agenda and the challenges that will come when we're going to implement Paris Agreement. People like to say that COP26 is the ending of the negotiations, and I prefer to say that the COP26 should be the starting of a new reality at the global level, okay, or the beginning of the new reality of the global level. And this means that we need to understand what is happening, not only on climate change, but also how climate geopolitics is coming into this transformative, this transition of the world, and how indeed we'll face it. The challenges, not trying to finance, but to act the new direction that means net zero or decarbonized world, or as someone now would like to say, a net positive world consider carbon economy. So I think that the last year or this year should be exposed to different reports on climate change. Make sure that we will have no alternative without moving forward consider climate change. So I think that the real pragmatism came with the science now, and you need to put in the past the politics of beliefs, as some used to say, that in my personal opinion, again, it's especially responsible for the action that you postponed solutions in the last 20 years, if I can use this with generosity. I think that this year, yesterday you have the last report about this, that was UNEP GAP emission report that shows that how distant we are of the 1.50 zero degrees Celsius degrees, and so also you have G20 summit that will happen exactly the weekend before the beginning of COP26. And everyone that was engaged along this year, considering this summit, G20 summit prep process, we understood and we learned that we have different players that came into the room exactly to address climate transition. And the economic players are one of the key ones that are absolutely co-responsible, if I can use this expression between quotes, to be engaged and also to manage this agenda to move forward. And the financial sector should play and must play an important role considering climate risk and climate vulnerabilities. It's also true that sometimes people it's easy to say that you have a consensus about climate change today, but really hard task to put this in practice. So bring all the actors together at macro and micro levels is a hard task, okay? And the problem needs to be replied by the real actions, real decisions, and reduce emissions. At the same time, Anatoni, I think that you manage this because you moderate the panel. You have now a new trend that is looking to bring adaptation and mitigation together. And the focus is to build up resilience. And all right, Anna, I think that it's really important to understand this, because when you go, Juliano, into the national strategies to address climate change, you used to have at the national levels, for example, in Brazil, it's clear, of course, that the government is looking forward to postpone, but the focus is how you should mitigate and how we need to do this. But at the same time, I think that to address climate transition, as I used to say, it's important to bring things together and also to tackle social and environmental inequalities, because it's something that the pandemic crisis made clear that we cannot postpone this, okay? Also, I think that when you go into the climate governance and try to discuss this, not only based on United Nations systems, Rachel, you know this better than I, the challenge of the new multilateral system, the inclusive network multilateralism that the Secretary General is proposing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality says that we need to cut emissions, we need to remove carbon from the atmosphere, we need to be resilient, we need to be adapt, and offset is not enough. Okay, so my feeling is that very different, the tensions that we will have on the table, considering cut emissions, the strategy to cut emissions, I think they're very different that we had in the past, for example, the last 10 years. So to discuss these perspectives, so climate governance, and also the challenge of new actors or new stakeholders, the role of the finance to go with concrete actions, we need funds, but we need more than this. We need to deal with risks, vulnerabilities, uncertainties, and how indeed the markets, the global markets, how indeed they will host this, how indeed the financial constituency and the economic constituency will host this, and how indeed they would like to manage this with concrete actions and permanent solutions. It's very important also to understand how the short-term perspectives will impact or delay what you need to do, consider the climate transition this decade that's critical to move in the into the right direction, the new direction of the world. So what for me have been really been discussing recently, okay, so we need, as COP26 is not the end, it's the beginning of something new, okay, how to act? Because everyone's agreed that need to act, but how to act? Let's go into the real world. Let's go into the contradictions that we have today, the bottlenecks that we have today. How you go into the global geopolitics, the tensions between the United States and China, the role of China is so critical, so strategic to move this needle in the new direction. And indeed, how you can come into new other realities that come together when you're looking for to address global crisis or the triple planetary crisis as we are named recently. So big planetary is a challenge, not global. It's something that everyone is looking for to address, consider the new relationship between humanity and nature. And pandemic crisis is a good example of how disruptive this process could be or can be. Is it something that should be discussed? Because next year we'll be engaged to discuss planetary boundaries, the new perspective of the environment agenda. Climate is an important key driver, a strategic driver to bring things together or not. So we have been discussing in climate, planetary boundaries, tipping points. This have some sense, makes sense in short-term perspectives, or this is a new process that will take time and we need to address concrete action in short-term perspectives. It's something that is very important to understand when to go into the global governance. And we are looking forward to bring climate as, in my opinion, the strategic umbrella to host these different trends or the different challenges. Also, I think that we have another side of the world that is very important, the other side of the coin, sorry, to consider the global society movements, because it's changing, okay? And you have elections, what's happening in Germany, Anna, how we have the election in Germany and also United States, Rachel, and also probably what's happening next year in France, I'm not sure yet, okay? But the social movements looking for climate justice, looking for transparency, social and environmental to address social inequalities, and also democracy, seems something very important that will come into this contest. And finally, as I mentioned informally before we begin this dialogue, this conversation, trust between developing and developed countries. We have to avoid the mistakes of the past. It's very important. My best feeling is that sometimes trust today is managed to consider the pledge of $100 billion per year that Paris Agreement hosts. And I'm not sure this is not enough, okay? This is the strategy to indeed put in practice, in my opinion, the key article of Paris Agreement, of the Paris Agreement, that is Article 4, okay? That's raise ambition, progressiveness, indeed how we go into the net zero or the decarbonization process. So climate financial pact, we can go into this world. We have probably some things that should be discussed only to provoke you and to know more about your experience and your vision. But discussing this, consider finance, you have some solutions that you know this today that people are discussing, like climate financial packages, considering the basket of source of money that should address solutions to finance climate action. Anna, again, I'm provoking you, okay, and then also Rachel, okay. And then the other side that brings multilateral funds, that so should bring philanthropy funds, market funds, it's impressive, okay? And the other side is that they have the carbon climate clubs, as Winston liked to mention, and as the new Germany chancellor wrote about this as the former finance minister, and also as some countries used to debate, for example, the carbon climate clubs are a new economic and political reality. I'm not sure how to organize this, what are the types that you can have for these carbon clubs by countries or by regional interests, so for example, economic sectors. What I think that we need to avoid if we're discussing carbon climate clubs, we need to avoid the carbon country clubs. So it's something very, I cannot resist, okay? But we need to avoid the triple C, that the carbon country clubs, again, that to put the world apart, or even it's not possible to minimize the risks and the damage of these political situations in the next years. So it's based on this that I am have these opening remarks now. And I would like, before back to hold this to Anna, to introduce the panelists, okay? Because I forgot this, sorry. And Anna and I were really, really very happy to have you today. So you have Rachel Kites, as you can see her. I'm sorry, but she's really a good friend of us, okay? So we're so informally, everyone's here, they are good friends for us. But Rachel is the fourth dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University. She also was graduated there as a Global Master of Arts program and a professor of practice at the school since 2012. Rachel is the first woman to lead the nation's oldest graduate-only school of international affairs in the United States. So proud of. I remember when she wrote me telling this, I was so proud. She's also, prior to joining Fletcher, Kite served as a special representative of the United Nations Secretary General and a Chief Executive Officer of Sustainable Energy for All, the famous C for All, okay? And she previously was the World Bank Group Vice President and a Special Envoy for Climate Change, leading the run-up of the Paris Agreement. Mrs. Kite is a member of the United Nations Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Group on Climate Action and an advisor to the UK government for the United Nations Climate Talks, COP26. She has really, really a fantastic curriculum, okay, something impressive. But I think that the nuance is that she's also she's also the chair of the ESG Committee of the Private Infrastructure Development Bank, and also the vice president of the Voluntary Market on Carbon. Is this something that she was recently nominated? Is this? Okay, this is Mrs. Rachel Kite, but I think that's really, really very important. She's a really good friend of Brazil, okay? And this is, for me, a really important asset. Well, another one that's coming together is our friend Winston Fritsch. Winston is trustee of the Brazilian Center of CEBRI, of International Relations. Dr. Fritsch is the president director of the Structured Development and Project Finance and Winston Fritsch Associated Consultants. He was the CEO of Petro Energia, managing director of the Lehman Brothers in Brazil, CEO of the Dresden Bank in Brazil, partner of Rio Bravo Investments, and senior partner of Orient Investment associated with Nomura Securities. He was chairman of the board of the Brazilian Association of International Banks and member of the board of Brazilian National Banks Association, FEBRABAN, okay? He's in Brazilian government. She was secretary of economic policy at the Ministry of Finance. He was director of the School of Economics and Administration of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, dean of the Center of Social Science of the Catholic University in Brazil, and also professor of the MBA program of COPEAD's graduate school, which is the business school of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and a member of the International Advisory Board of London Business School. Also, Winston receives a bachelor's and master's degree in engineering in Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and the PhD in economics was from the University of Cambridge. So, God, it's impressive. Okay, Winston, be welcome, close friend. He's also a good friend of us. And finally, I think that the youngest, I'm sure it's the youngest one, Juliana Assunção. Okay, really a good friend, really a good partner also. Work hard with land use and consumer protection production agenda in Brazil. Okay, since 2011, if I can remember, if I'm right. She is the director of Climate Policy Initiative in Brazil and professor in the Department of Economics of Catholic University here in Rio de Janeiro. He is associate editor of Environment and Development Economics and of the Revista Brasileira de Economia. He is also a member of the Consortium of Financial Systems and Poverty at the University of Chicago, and the Brazil Lab in Princeton University, and the research at J. Paul. Juliano holds a PhD in economics from PUC Rio de Janeiro, the Catholic University, and a master in economics from the Federal University of Minas Gerais, and a bachelor in economics also Federal University of Minas Gerais. So it's a hybrid man from Minas Gerais together with Rio de Janeiro, and an international player. And so these are the good friends that today we discussed with us. We shared our screen, and more to this, to have the opportunity to be together virtually, but I hope soon, Rachel, that we can be together in Glasgow. So Anna, you have the screen, okay? You moderate everyone. So you have Rachel first. After Rachel, have our Winston that will bring some numbers, okay? These economists, please understand this. And also Juliano will bring the Brazilian perspectives, a good debate considering what's happening here in private sector and financial sector. So thank you very much again for joining us. Back to you, my dear friend, Anna. Go on.
Thank you, Isabella. Thank you so much for this introduction and huge CVs from our panelists today. Rachel, thank you ever so much for making the time. We know we are super busy now on preparations for the COP. So I go straight to you, as Isabella already introduced everybody. The way we will do is giving the words to Rachel for her to describe not only the governance of climate, which we have been discussing quite a bit here at CEBRI, but specifically looking at the governance in relation to finance and financial mechanisms, and which type of accountability we have on them. Some of them Isabella already mentioned. After Rachel make her exposition, we go to Winston and then to Juliano, have a small conversation among us. And in the last 10, 15 minutes of our debate, we will open for questions and answers from the public as well. So if they have, please already write to us, but we will have a conversation among us. So Rachel, word is with you, please.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm already in London so that I can acclimatise before going north to Scotland on the weekend. And so I'm delighted to be here. I'm a little intimidated by having to speak before Winston Fritsch and Juliano, but I'll do my best. And forgive me for only being able to do this in English as well. So to pick up on this question of on the Monday morning after COP26, no matter how much it has succeeded against the odds really of this geopolitical moment, there is work to do. And there is work to do because we are living in an era where we are increasingly in what I would call hybrid governance, that the traditional ways in which we have governed ourselves globally, economically, globally from a climate perspective, are beginning to reach the limits of their possibility. They are perhaps fraying at the edges. We see tensions and difficulties in the Bretton Woods institutions, in the WTO, in UNCTAD, all created 70 or more years ago. And even if they weren't fraying at the edges, the interpretation of their mandates for this particular moment in history perhaps needs something of a refresh. So are they fit for purpose for a world where over the next 20 to 30 years, we need to manage the global economy for greater equity, greater equality, or less inequality, and where we need to decarbonize and build resilience? So we have a system that doesn't quite get us to where we want to go. It is not discussing in a fully integrated way the challenges of this moment. I'll talk about how far I think we have come, but I don't think we've fully embraced the challenge that we have. And what's happening is you're seeing coalitions of government and private sector actors with civil society and think tanks and academia sort of breaking away and setting up platforms of different character to try to move the thinking forward and to try to fill the gaps of the evident inability to be able to talk about how we need to govern ourselves. So we're already in that era of hybrid governance, and we can see that from the plethora of platforms that were created in the run-up to Paris and then since Paris, whether it's in food and land use, or whether it's on voluntary carbon markets, or whether it's on all of the coalitions from the financial sector, from asset owners to asset managers to banks now and insurance companies, all setting up sort of informal rules for themselves about how they can understand the limits or the opportunities as they try to make themselves fit for purpose for decarbonisation and other aspects of a climate agenda. So in that world, which we're already in, it's imperfect, and we're seeing conversations and tensions around that. But I think there are two big questions for the Monday morning after COP. One is, who will bring us together and bring together and form the points of connection between the trade regime, the finance, international finance, and the international economic governance regimes, so that they are so that we are actually talking about the need to speed the transition away from our current trajectory and build in more resilience into the global economy. How do we build those points of connection? Because at the moment, if we're expecting that is for the G20 to do and the G7 to do, it's not working. Not working because that's probably not yet politically understood as being fully necessary, but also we don't have the leaders. You have to have committed multilateralists, both in the leadership of the Gs and then in the membership, sufficient to be able to respond quickly to an emergency. And if we look back to the G20 in 2009, in the teeth of the global financial crisis, where it roused itself to at least begin to have a pathway forward, we saw intense personal diplomacy from committed multilateralists in key governments, working tirelessly 24/7 to be able to bring that about. You could argue that in 2021, we're in a similar emergency from a climate perspective, but we haven't seen that level of engagement, either by the UK presidency of the G7 and also the presidency of COP26. And then I think with a little bit more energy sometimes from the Italians, it's still not comparable. And of course, even though we've had a transition in leadership in the US, the US is back, but they're back in a, back to the future. That's not back to the future as a kind of new way of being back. And then of course we have issues of nationalism, insularism, or populism in other countries as well. So this point of connection, I think, is there has to be a place where, if climate is an emergency, then the way in which we are regulating the financial markets, the way we're regulating and managing the trade regime, the way that we're managing then sort of development and development finance, somehow have to come together in a constant conversation, and that is just not there at the moment. And then secondly, there is the question of, if that is connection, the second issue is integrity. So we are living in a world now where the good news is that everybody understands that we need to move towards a decarbonized global economy. The good news is that people are beginning to understand that you can't do that for just 1% of the population. It has to be inclusive. People are beginning to understand that has to be something which allows us to be more at peace with nature. So this sensibility is beginning to sink in, and you can see leadership in every sector of the economy, but we have no guardrails around the integrity of what we will do that will allow us to drive the economy to 1.5 degrees and allow us to drive the economy so that we've got more finance flowing to the parts of the global economy that need it in order to sustain ourselves to achieve the objectives of 1.5 degrees. So obviously there's, very different opinions about, given where we are in our journey towards 1.5 degrees, how close we are to running out of our carbon budget, whose numbers we should really believe when we understand how close we are to running out of our carbon budget. There is great consternation at the lack of transparency, the lack of good accounting and whose accounting rules, a lack of discipline, and I think in some cases a lack of humility from many people within the private sector and the financial sector as they make their bold pledges. The same applies to government and government's pledges in many cases. And this lack of this absence, whether or not it is sort of premeditated or just accidental, feeds into an extremely low level of social trust that we have within societies and then between the developing world and the developed world. And so we have a toxic atmosphere around the absence of integrity in the mechanisms that we may build and this is a cry really that we will need to build that into this new architecture. And by that I can be very specific in terms of the need for definitions around high integrity, I think, in these new hybrid platforms. And so, if we are going to count, $34 trillion of investments in some part of the financial sector as being net zero, then we need to know that we're comparing apples to apples. We need to know what baseline we're working off. We need to know who's counting the apples to apples. We need to know if any of those apples have been tampered with. We need somebody to say, no, that is an apple. No, that's an orange. That one doesn't count. We have none of these mechanisms, and we don't even have the guardrails for understanding if there's even a fruit basket. So I think that this is really important work. And I think there are people of goodwill in every sector of the economy, in the private sector, in the financial sector, in government, in the international sector, including the Secretary General, who know that we've got to engage in this. But I think there is some confusion because there are different theories of change about how we drive the finance sector to drive things forward. I think there's quite some interesting discussions in the period coming after COP around, do we think that we can only survive with green, or do we need to go from brown to green? And how comfortable are we when we are dealing with the brown that wants to become green? And this translates itself into, is there any role for a listed oil company in a voluntary carbon market? Is there any ability to invest in a brown company's green products as it becomes greener? Or is that, if you are running an investment strategy, can you only invest in something that is already squeaky green, right? Or squeaky clean? And you see these traumas in investment decisions and in government regulatory decisions and in civil society engagement decisions everywhere. And I think we're all over the map at the moment, which I think is okay at this point in the transition. But again, we need guardrails. And then just about the financial package that will come out of COP in some shape or form, I think there are three big issues. So we're going to see a financial package where you see this sort of coughing up of a hairball, right? If any of you have a cat or as a pet, or the process of getting any agreement on the 100 billion of public money that is the climate pledge for 2020 has been watching a cat, bring a hairball up, and the hairball, we now have the hairball. It was declared on Monday. It's not very pretty, and it doesn't give us what we want. I mean, basically, it's a sort of begrudging it is more transparent. We can actually see what will count, but it's a way to get to 500 billion by 2025, hoping that everything will get backloaded from 2023 to 2025. Well, for the developing world, they've been there before. And this is like being slow walked, right? You're being slow walked to a destination that isn't the one that you want to go to. So I'm not sure how much that will actually help the politics in Glasgow. There is also then that 50% of this finance is going to be adaptation. This is what we call in the United States a Band-Aid, or in England a plaster over a wound. because, you know, 50% of not very much is not enough. And we haven't even begun to really look at what the contours of the agreement will be on the financing of loss and damage, which of course is a huge issue. And so just three things. Public money needs to be in larger amount. Public money needs to leverage private money. And the experience of this in the last few years is woeful, including the fact that the multilateral development banks, who have promised consistently that they will leverage private money from all of the riches that we continue to give them, in the last two capital rounds for the World Bank, they still leverage their most public funds at basically 1-to-1. This has to be resolved, especially if they are going to be recipients of even more money in the reallocation of IMF SDRs. And then thirdly, there needs to be the leverage of private money, and private money has to be induced into doing things that it's not going to do otherwise. And which brings us back to the need for regulation and going beyond a hybrid governed world. So I think that there is, I think it's complicated and messy. It would be much better if we had effective carbon prices, if we had effective regulation. It would be much easier if the financial taxonomies of the US, the EU, and China came together in some seamless way. It would be very nice if we had a trade regime which internalized the climate emergency. We don't have any of those things yet. We have progress towards them. And we have a mindset, I think, of deep distrust for good reasons in developing countries and within communities, within developing countries, middle-income countries and rich countries who have not seen finance coming to them for their ability to cope with this transition. And we have a frustration in the techno-optimistic finance leaders around the world who believe that they can figure this out if we just sort of let them get on with it. In the middle is all of us, and it will be interesting to see how hard we have to work over the next year.
Rachel, thanks ever so much. No, you gave a wonderful talk exactly where we are. Not, I would say, very optimistic, but very realistic where we are. And I would just add that on the top of all this, you know, the two major questions that you put on bringing us together from trade to financial system and the integrity issue is obviously we need to figure all this out very quickly, because it's an emergency. It's not that we have 10 years or 20 years to figure out. We have two years maximum to figure out all of this, which obviously makes it all more complicated. And can we, as you said, trust the financial market to lead when so many people feel that they are, parts of them are the reasons why we are here. So there's so many big questions for us to answer in very short time, not only for this debate, but definitely to come up with some answers. But let me pass straight to Wilston to hear, obviously, reactions to what Rachel said and compliments. And then afterwards, I pass to Juliano. Please, Wilston.
Thank you very much. And well, I will start to begin to congratulating Jean Kite on the very comprehensive, very up-to-date and realistic assessment. I mean, she pointed to the critical problems of urgency, and that's fundamental, integrity, the need for carbon markets, and the role the financial sector can play in a world of cacophony about what to do. And she touched it it's a very complex system. And what we're discussing here, and I'll touch upon these points as I go along, we're discussing here is the future of the global governance system on climate change. I mean, global governance is a process, it evolves. And as a process, it has tipping points. And I feel that Glasgow, or more appropriately, COP26 and a few years ahead, but COP26 will not be the end or the beginning of anything. It's a tipping point in the process. But when definitions, given the complexity of the problem and the whole set of unfinished business we have in climate governance, it's the beginning of the process. But why is it a tipping point? That's an important thing, because some things have changed in the background. I think three things changed. First, and that's consensus science. I mean, the huge amount of data that you can process today, the betterment of climate models. I mean, today you have scientific consensus on the problem, which is something we didn't have 20 years ago. So this is an important thing, and I don't think this is subject to discussion. But the second point, I think, was the pandemic. It plays an important role because climate change is a political process. Awareness from science does not lead automatically to action. And it's very important to understand that the impacts of the pandemic was not because we left our cars at home, there was less smoke, and the world looked better, and so people start saying, oh, climate matters. No, not at all. It's the political impact of the way we dealt with the pandemic, because it showed that without multilateral international cooperation, you cannot fight a problem which is a global externality. And I think also that the pandemic restored the momentum towards international cooperation by delivering a very serious blow on the 20th century right, if we can say, the right-wing revival of the 20th century, 21st century, which was based on an ideology centered on both nationalistic leadership and a delirious negationism of scientific consensus. So I think that's very important. I mean, to have a COP26 without Trump is a great win. Okay, so this is an important thing. But I also see, and that's my third point, and then I'll dive into it until the end of my intervention. The financial sector is changing skin. And that's very, very important because money makes the world go around. And I see that they have already started and will continue to have tremendous implications on the way we think about it. First, I think the appearance, the acting of the financial system on these issues strengthened the awareness that the current global governance architecture is totally inadequate to the task of inducing the radical decarbonization that we need to avoid disaster in 2 generations. The absence of cooperative and mandatory rules of economic carrots and sticks in the present UN framework can lead to disaster. This is a problem that now is clear. I mean, it's not that there's great progress, and as you see, but without an important change in the climate governance architecture that we have today, that places a price in carbon for large emitters, creates other incentives and policies to induce the huge flows of money that we need for the transition, I think we're doomed. The numbers are gigantic. Isabella asked me to put numbers, as I'm an economist, I should deal with numbers. And I'll put some which really hair-splitting. I mean, investments, I mean, balance sheet allocations needed to attain the objectives of COP26, of limiting global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees in the next 3 decades, estimated by over $100 trillion, 100 and 120. These are numbers that the GFANs, the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, Cambridge, in Glasgow, are working with. So it's McKinsey-based number. These are obviously ballpark figures, but it's of that order of magnitude. And the frightening number is that over 2/3 of this money has to be directed to less developed or developing countries, where capital markets are less developed, and the exchange rate risk frightens private sector investment from developed countries. And of the 7 to 80 trillion that would have to be invested in developing countries, only about 25% would be from governments and multilateral organizations. So there's a huge amount of private money, about 2 trillion a year, coming as either directly or blended finance with multilateral organizations and public institutions in the country. So it's a daunting task, even we consider that in the horizon of 3 decades of a generation. So this is an enormous task for the private sector to do. So, I mean, given the numbers, it's almost inevitable that, I mean, the financial sector started, and especially, I mean, not only bankers and financial institutions, but the regulators started seeing this as a huge risk. actually the G20 declared in the last meeting events that that climate risk is the biggest systemic risk for the international financial system. And I think this climate urgency will change that in forever. I mean, financing the transition is a challenge, perhaps higher than devising the technologies that we need to do the transition, the things that have not been invented, that have to be invented for the transition. This financial technology is a challenge of at least an equal size. But it's also true, and I think Jim Kite mentioned that, and she actually worked on that, a lot has been done to do the plumbing, to do the nuts and bolts that any system that uses, that prices the externality, etc., will have to use, that the financial system will have to use. First, there was Article 6 in the Paris Agreement, which was very important. I mean, it was the idea to start an effective global integrated carbon market. That would immensely help addressing and coordinating the transition. It was a concrete attempt actually to finish the building of UN arrangements, but it remained a huge, largely unfinished business which has to be mended in a way. Second, the financial system, I mean, again understood as both institutions and regulators, has shown an increasing awareness of the risks, and it rose actually before Paris. I think if you want to pinpoint a point where the financial system got worried with that, you get Mark Carney's speech at the Lloyd's of London just before the COP in 2015, to the Paris COP in 2015. And actually, it was not by chance that he made that speech. I mean, he was at the time the chairman of the Bank of England, and the leader of, actually the governor of the Bank of England, and the chairman of the Financial Stability Board of the G20. This was an important turning point. And since then, the G20 took to himself several very important things. The first was the creation of the Task Force on Climate Change Disclosures, the financial disclosures called the TCFD, which create a lot of climate risk management procedures now being adapted by a lot of central banks, including the Brazilian Central Bank. The IFRS, which is this foundation that dictates accounting rules to all countries in the world, perhaps except the United States, by the way, is setting up climate reporting statements. The IMF will include climate policy reviews in their national reviews of every year. So an immense amount of things important for the financial system to work and to address risk have been done. All these necessary building blocks for the effective work of a carbon market are already in place or getting into place. So even if we do not converge quickly to a global carbon market, the convergence of standards, and especially the converging rules to evaluate climate risk and related financial risks, is key to support this movement that Rachel Kite pointed as important for the financial system to get organized in a way to deal with these attempts. National, subnational attempts, they all need this plumbing. They all need these things that are being done. So that's good news in a way. Moreover, there is this increasing awareness by the private sector that led to the creation of these voluntary markets. Voluntary markets are markets outside the compliance regulated markets that could be created by governments, by regions, by states, basically by governments in general. And they grew immensely. Over the past 2-3 years, they just jumped. And obviously here, what Rachel calls integrity is fundamental. I mean, greenwashing in these markets could kill what was really a wonderful thing. But because these markets moved really by a lot of people that believe in what they're doing. I mean, they really want to put money to help transition. But they have to know that, I mean, they're putting money on something that is really helping the transition. So This is a fast-growing market, but needs to be regulated. And I think it has been a lot of arrangements to increase integrity in this market. And this can grow enormously, can grow to over $100 billion from the less than $1 billion it has today. It's still not obviously far from being sufficient to do the whole transition, talking a factor of 1 to 100, but this can be immensely important, and especially important for some areas which are very, very attractive for Brazil, like nature-based solutions. But these markets, these voluntary markets, they go very much towards this kind of investments. I mean, the investors like nature-based solutions. And for Brazil, this is very important. For investments in reforestation, biome restoration, this is very important. And they're going to grow. Now, and here I begin to finish, and I see a tremendous opportunity and a huge risk in COP26. We can launch this virtual circle of credible regulation, investments, more credible regulation. Actually, Janet Yellen, the present Treasury Secretary of the United States, has a fantastic view, a graphic view of this virtual circle. It really exists, but it has to be started. And if we fail to signal to markets by regulatory clarity, consistency, would wreck the political feasibility for the transition and help the negationists, the short-term vested interest, and obviously to eventually a climate crisis. So COP26 is crucial. I mean, never in the history of climate conference the cost of failure have been so high. And I think there's a serious attempt, and I want to make it with emphasis that point, because this is, I think, the way out, not now, but within, let's say, 1 or 2 years. There's a serious attempt at trying to push the idea for a nucleus of a carbon market in a club of high emitters in the G20. The G-funds, this group of private investors, have committed $90 trillion of private money to investments in transition, and Europe will press for changes. Europe, led by Germany, will press for changes. However, I mean, Europe is a falling emitter. It emits less and less because it has priced carbon in a more effective way than the rest of the world. And still, it's a small emitter. I mean, without China, I mean, nothing will be done in that direction. I mean, China is responsible for almost a third of emissions today. And the magic of this club is that it has to be, or the precondition of the club, is that the founding fathers must be high emitters. The United States obviously will be the second mega emitter. It could be an important piece, but the American executive doesn't have credibility in contentious issues that are contentious in the US Congress. We have a divided US Congress today, and that's a problem. But China is okay. So even if you do not see progress towards the creation of a global carbon market, in COP26, I think that what has been done, what will be done in terms of preparing the way for a global carbon market is going to work. And eventually, I think some form of club is going to happen. But I want to close it in a positive note. And I think that ambition is high at COP26. We're in a unprecedented sense of climate urgency. The pandemic had important positive changes in the political feasibility of strong action. And for Brazil, it's almost ludicrous that with a negationist president, the basic agenda of creating a high integrity flow of information to investors being implemented by our central bank. We were doing the homework. There's a bill in Congress to create the underpinnings of a national carbon market. This is all good news. But that goes, even though the government cannot get its act together to go to COP26 with a clear agenda, which actually those points, I think Juliana will discuss. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wilson. I know, obviously, as you said, the expectations for COP26 are really, really high. And sometimes I even get afraid on how high they are and how people are going to manage to get there. I am actually in Germany, as you talked, and as you discussed, the issue of clubs not the G20, 20 or G7 club, but clubs is obviously very high on the agenda. I hear discussions about clubs related to sectors, not just among rich nations, but by say steel or chemicals or different types of clubs is obviously also on the agenda. But one other issue that's really high here that I can hear is the advantage of carbon market versus a carbon price, a carbon taxes within those clubs, which will be, in terms of integrity, easier to implement than the market. And let us see where that goes. Definitely not at COP, but that's something that we can see there are many nations, at least here in Europe, discussing how we're going to deal with carbon, just put carbon prices. That would be much cleaner. But on that, you talked about land use sector and the opportunities for Brazil. And I want to ask Juliano then to come into the conversation. Please, Juliano, with you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Anna. I pretty much agree with the fact that dealing with this huge challenge involves action at different levels, right? And I'm going to focus my remarks here on the Brazil, trying to show the potential for Brazil. And what strikes me is the fact that Brazil can perform quite well in a low carbon economy, and we were supposed to have our homework done, and we're supposed to be pushing this agenda along the lines that Isabella played quite well in the past, right? But for the reasons that everyone understands, I think we are missing a huge opportunity, and I'm trying to describe these opportunities here. I was thinking about sharing some 6 graphs, but I'm not sure if I can. My share screen is functioning. So yeah, so let me try to describe what's going on in those graphs while I can put them on screen. Maybe
you cannot see them yet.
Yeah, I think I'm not allowed to share screen.
Yeah, maybe.
No. Yeah, I can. Nana, if you allow me. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the first point is that if you look at what's going on in the global agriculture production, something quite interesting is happening. On the one hand, the world has been able to increase quite continuously the agriculture production in a continuous way since 1960s. But if you try to decompose the nature of that expansion in agriculture production, you get something quite interesting around the 2000s, because what you can see from the FAO data is that from 1961 up to 2001, the world has managed to increase its production, combining area expansion with productivity gains, right? We combine those two things. But something happened in the last 20 years or so. The world has been able to increase its production in a total amount of area that is decreasing, slightly decreasing, right? So the possibility of producing more in existing and cleared lands is more than a theoretical possibility. It's something that is happening at the global scale for a long time, right? This is what's going on the production of agricultural goods globally, right? If you, I think I'm on here. No, not yet. Well, if you come to Brazil, what you will find is a country in which we have a lot of forests. But more important than having those forests that are there and a substantial fraction of our territory is the fact that due to historical reasons, we have a huge amount of pastures and a huge room for increasing our crop production, especially converting pastures into croplands, right? Just to give an idea, the total cropland in Brazil is about 75 million hectares. And if you take all of the pastures, we are talking about more than almost 230 million hectares, right? Which is about 3 times the amount of pastures that we have. So since the colonial period, we've been making many choices based on the idea that land was abundant, and based on the idea that we need to occupy the territory for a border defense, and so on and so forth. But the fact is that, you know, we are entering this climate game with a situation that allows us to increase a lot our agricultural production, because most of these lands are being used pretty much below their more effective way, their potential, right? So we can increase our production in those lands, and at the same time we can tackle simultaneously food security and climate change. And I think there is no other country in the world that could play that game at that scale, right? In the way that we're doing. And this is also aligned with the underlying evolution of agriculture in Brazil, right? If you consider the last 40 to 50 years of agricultural evolution in the country, what you'll see is a continuous productivity gains and this change of pasture, this replacement of pastures by cropland. This has been the rule in most of the regions. The only region in which this process is not happening this way is the northern region, in which we have the Amazon, right? But all of the other regions in where most of our production takes place.
I'm very sorry to just interrupt you. I know Rachel has sharps. She will have to go straight on the time, so she doesn't want to be rude. So if she disappears, just before she disappears, and we can continue a little bit of the conversation. But I just publicly really want to thank Rachel. I'm sorry we don't have much time to discuss, but I'm sure this will be continued. Thank you so much, Rachel. And
thank you, Rachel. Good to see you.
Go ahead. And
right. Well, so we are in this situation, right, in which not only Brazil has a lot of room to increase its agricultural production and mainly through this replacement of pasturage into crops, but also this is something that is happening in all of the regions in the country in the last 40 to 50 years, except the northern region, in which agriculture is expanding in terms of its lands, primarily generating deforestation and so on. So I think we are facing this opportunity that is tangible, is concrete, and it's pretty much aligned with important processes in places in most of the regions in Brazil, right? And on the other hand, if you look at if you consider the forest agenda, Brazil has a huge achievement dealing with deforestation, especially after 2004, when it put in place a system of command and control that started to use satellite imagery as the basis for action, and followed by many other initiatives that built up a system that was quite effective in order to deal with deforestation. And this was a huge contribution of the country to the climate agenda, probably one of the most important contributions worldwide. And this was based on technology and a political arrangement, and I would say the policy management of those who were in office during that period, right? And we were able to manage something around 80% of reduction in deforestation from 2004 up to 2012. And from there, we see some increase in deforestation rates, and that increase became more dramatic in the last probably 2 years, right? But we are still pretty far from the previous levels, because although we have important changes in the governance around deforestation policies, I think the system has some resilience, right? I think the capacity, the technical capacity of the government, although the political layer, the technical capacity of the government has some resilience, and I think this is why we are still far from the peak that we observed in 2004, but it's deteriorating over time, right? And during this time, what's interesting is that we were able to reduce pretty dramatically deforestation in the Amazon, and at the same time, agriculture GDP in the Amazon increased, right? So more than double if you consider the period, a specific period in which we were observing the most important reduction in deforestation. So we really don't need deforestation in order to deal with to expand our production, right? So I think that the role that is becoming more and more aware of the climate challenge, and the role that is mobilizing resources in different forms to deal with this issue, in which the nature-based solutions is increasing in importance. Starting with some language around it, but more recently there are more and more debates and discussions about the importance of nature-based solutions as part of the portfolio of solutions to the climate crisis. I think Brazil is super well positioned, right? And another way of seeing that, and this will be my last comment, this will be my last slide, was the forest regeneration that we see in the Amazon, which is pretty remarkable. INPE has published this analysis of what's happening in those areas that were deforested, in the past. And what we see from that data is that something around 1/4, 25% of all of the areas that were deforested in Brazil, in the Amazon, they are abandoned and in some form of regeneration, right? So this idea of forest restoration, and that is a substantial part of the so-called nature-based solutions, is something in which Brazil has a lot of potential as well, and something that is in place. If you consider the period between 2004 and 2014, a period of 10 years, the increase of secondary vegetation in the Amazon, that was a pretty natural process, was at the order of 7 million hectares, right? So this is despite any policy, any effort promoting those things. But this illustrates two things. On the one hand, how wasteful has been our deforestation, and second, what's the real potential of Brazil to have a key role on the agenda of forest restoration, in which you really see, not only in the Amazon, but also in Atlantic forest and other parts of the country, places in which forest regeneration is a pretty natural kind of process. And I think this, if we manage, if we do our homework, I think we can benefit quite a bit of a role that is becoming more and more concerned about the climate war, the climate crisis, right? So I think I'll stop here to the time constraints.
Thank you, Juliano. And I don't know if we now go back to Portuguese or not, if we stay in English, or as Rachel now left us, because obviously we don't know if we have just English speaker listening to us, and Rachel also have left. But I think that the message is becoming really clear, the picture, and I think all of you brought pieces of it. What to expect from COP, and the type of work that Rachel said, what we need to do just the day after COP, and how to bring those things together. So if we think the challenge is at the COP, I think she brought very, very strongly that the challenge, yes, is the COP, but after COP, the challenge was even bigger, is just greater, that we will need to, for us to mention that. I think the other message that she brought is that the need of us getting our act together, also not only on the amount of money, but on the integrity. And I think that's a really key message. And I think Wilson also mentioned that on the voluntary markets, how we're going to manage the integrity issue is absolutely vital. Here, what we see is we're talking about public money. We need the public money. There's no doubt. Private money. We do need private money. Carbon markets, voluntary and regulatory, the official carbon market. Philanthropic money, we can see that they are also coming in. And finally, multilateral money. Those will be like the way, this package of money. And one thing that we haven't been able to discuss here is why the UNFCCC is really good at now getting countries to get the emissions and the inventories and looking at how much emission each country is having per sector. The UNFCCC does not really have a big role on looking at the financial sector and looking at how much money is there in the system to deal with decarbonization. That's not there. Obviously, the 100 billion is there, but I don't see that the UNFCCC has the capacity or the governance structure to ensure that the commitments and financial commitments and the markets and all that we've been talking about is at place to serve the decarbonization and the mitigation and adaptation that we needed. So I think I would add to one of the questions that Rachel brought is financial system and trade system, the integrity issue, and also the monitoring and looking at the financial system as a whole that will lead to decarbonization. I think those are big challenges in front of us. I know we already went way out of our time, but I will just I can see that Wilson wanted to talk, just 2 minutes for Wilson, and also invited and then Isabella to then close the session, if I may. Wilson, please, 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Anna. I jumped in because we were talking about the importance of moving in all directions. That's absolutely true. And we move in some direction faster than the other because regulation and markets will be created. I think voluntary markets are going to go ahead. But I want to call attention that voluntary markets are based on offsets. Offsets like forests, etc. The size of this market is small relative to the challenge that you need to do the transition in terms of abatements, new technologies in the energy intensive and energy producing markets. So this is the big challenge, and that's big ball game. There you need really huge regulation, huge carbon prices being mandated, incentives, real big intervention. There are 2 things. It's very important that we start playing the ball. But the big ball game still, we need guidance on the thing, or we'll be facing even crisis because bad regulations is worse than no regulation. Markets need signaling. If you give wrong signals, you can have crises that are induced by a panic.
Yeah, and I think you're right, and that's what many people are saying. Big question is why isn't carbon pricing on the COP agenda? Why are we all talking about carbon market, and why haven't the COP presidency, the G7, the G20 put what we all been asking for, which is carbon price? Without putting that on the agenda would be really hard to move us quickly and to have clear signal as I think the market wants and needed. And I think one of the reasons why people are not, at least what they are saying, why they're not going for that is because they feel that they cannot subsidize the people that will lose most. So what they calling, especially in Europe, what the energy justice on people that will need that extra money. Maybe we should get a Bolsa Familia or on the helping Europe and other countries to get a Bolsa Familia for the energy justice of the transition that they need. But let us see what's happening. And definitely, Juliana, you're absolutely right. Brazil has a huge opportunity. we cannot see that they are seizing that opportunity, at least the government. We can see that the private side in Brazil is seizing that opportunity. And yeah, but there will be other COPs, and I'm sure Brazil will be up to speed. And as you said, there is a lot of resilience also with the public sector there to move quickly if that is needed. Isabella, last word with you, please.
Oh, thank you very much, Anna. I think that you have really good inputs here. And more than this, Rachel brought really a good perspectives considering the day after, based on the reality, what also Juliano and Winston highlighted. My feelings, my experience says that, okay, we know that to go into the reality, we know that I have real doubts considering the challenge for multilateral governance, what will be the transformative challenges for UNFCCC, not necessarily to deal with the markets, okay, or these dynamics, because you have other driving forces that will influence the countries and or the market interests. You need to repack everything and understand how the climate global governance will host this new agenda and these new players, etc., etc. This is something that not that I'm put apart, but something that we need to understand that they have different process dynamics and different political wishes that support this debate. Okay, and that's why also we have that this momentum, the transition of the multilateral systems. Our common agenda report from the Secretary General says or make clear what's the challenges, how will come in the future, considering the experience of pandemic crisis and how the global institution was not able to deal with the challenges of a global crisis. It's very illustrative. It's very interesting that you consider this. But my point here, okay, you have this world that's changed and China has come. I fully agree that you need to have an agreement between China and the United States, as we had in 2014 to have Paris. But I'm not sure if it's happened. Okay, I have other forces that is the game. But I think that there is something very important to observe when you go into our reality, and also the role that Brazil needs to play, or the role that would be very important for Brazil to play. Okay, Brazil must be back to this agenda, and Brazil is very important for the world, the climate community, not only because we need to preserve Amazonia and also to address 1.5 Celsius degrees. Okay. Not only because of planetary boundaries, a tipping point, etc., but also because this is very critical for our trajectory on the pathways for development. And for this, we need, before regulatory demands, we need vision. We need a national interest, full address, well-structured, what we want of this agenda, what we as Brazil, we want to manage this. It's not fake perspectives. Okay, we cannot launch a green recovery, a proposal of green recovery plan with no numbers, with no critical strategies, etc., etc. So my feeling is that, as you mentioned, and also Rachel, everyone here mentioned, public money is important, but public policy is critical. Public governance is critical. Okay, it's important that we have the subnational players coming together, like you have in Amazon, in the northeast of the country. But we need to be together. We need a new vision, a new unit of the country. We need Brazil understands how this agenda is important and how Brazil is part of the world. That's why at the beginning I mentioned that we are moving to a new perception of to be planetary. And this is not to be self-centered. Okay, this will put in the future, we push the really additional pressure to work, as Rachel mentioned, considering also Winston, where I should allocate funds, how I will allocate funds, what are the conditions that we need, not only the institutional conditions, the political ones, to be engaged and to address concrete solutions. So my vision is that, okay, you have a day after COP26, we'll have two challenges. Go into the reality, the global, and play there, but also come back to Brazil and work hard in the next year to have the best option 2023. But Brazil cannot waste time more. We cannot put this agenda aside. We cannot tackle climate as climate negationism as populism, etc., etc. This is very important to come in the core of the agenda. If not, Juliano, all the perspectives that we highlight very well that Brazil has, unfortunately, this will be against a good opportunity that will stay in the past. So thank you very much. And we need to bring the future of the present. And more than this, we need to be engaged. Okay, Brazil must be back. And more than this, Brazil must show how, what we need to regulate here, Winston. A question to end this. If you don't have an agreement in Article 6, let's see, okay? How Brazil will play this here? We need Article 6 to move forward. Why? You have carbon market since 1997 in the world. Okay, so what do you want for this agenda, and how we'd like to be engaged, and what are our commitments to be part of this climate age? Thank you very much for everyone that joined us. Okay, thank you, Anna. Back to you to end, and thank you for CEBRI staff, everyone. Thank you very much.
We got several questions here that unfortunately we are really late and don't have time to answer. So we will send your questions to some of the panelists here, and they hopefully will then be able to answer directly. I know people from CEBRI is already organizing it. So I just want to say again, thank you for CEBRI for hosting this debate, and we'll bring news from the COP. Isabel and I will be there, so hopefully we will have some discussions also bringing some fresh news on what happened to Article 6. And
not only Article 6, I think that's what happened to Article 4. Okay, this is the critical one. Okay,
and transparency and many other things.
Transparency, all the
Thank
time,
you so
transparency.
Much.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Juliana. Thank you, Isabella.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Anna. See you next week in Glasgow. Okay, bye-bye.